Hello, everybody. Good to see you here tonight. Hi, Dolores. Hey, Rob. Hi, Stacy. Nice to see you. Thank you for sharing. Please share as much as you can. I'm going to give this a minute or two for some more people to get here before I start in. Okay, I see Deborah Wilson is here and Russ Coleman. Hi, Russ. How you doing? And Lana has joined. Hi, Lana. Nice to see you. Please share this. I think I've got enough of a quorum now. And I'm going to start by recalling Stephanie's chapter 7 and her deficits that matter. The good jobs deficit, the savings deficit, the healthcare deficit, the education deficit, the infrastructure deficit, the climate deficit, okay, and the democracy deficit. And I'd like to suggest that the people's economy and the process of building an economy for the people ought to have something to do with erasing these 7 deficits that matter. Okay, and that the logic of the book, okay, is that we will have reached the people's economy when we've erased the 7 categories, okay, of deficits. When the gaps in these categories are much, much smaller, or even in some of the categories have been erased. So, with that as an introduction, let us go to chapter 8, the chapter entitled Building an Economy for the People. I'm so happy it's Thursday, Lana. So let's start to share. Stephanie starts off the final chapter by relating a story. It was summer of 2010 when Warren Mosler, who we first met in chapter 1, traveled to Kansas City, Missouri to join me for a meeting with Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, otherwise known as Manny Cleaver. He was a United Methodist pastor and the first African American mayor of Kansas City. In 2004, he was elected to represent the Missouri 5th Congressional District, a western central part of the state that included the University of Missouri at Kansas City, UMKC, where Stephanie had been teaching, where she taught for 17 years. Cleaver agreed to meet with us as a favor to a mutual friend, a local politician who happened to be working on a PhD at my university. And Steph says, I'll never forget that meeting. The Great Recession, 2007-2009, was technically over, but the economy was still in shambles. Almost 10% of the labor force was without work, and the African American youth aged 16 to 19 unemployment rate was nearly 50%. As Mosler and I saw it, the $787 billion stimulus package passed by Congress in February of 2009 hadn't done nearly enough to end the foreclosure crisis and put millions of people back to work. Warren Mosler believed Congress could essentially fix things in 3 easy steps. First, he wanted a federally funded job guarantee to make sure that every unemployed worker could immediately transition back into paid employment. Second, he called for a payroll tax holiday that would have temporarily reduced the withholding for Social Security payroll taxes from 6.2% to 0. This would have been tantamount to a 6.2% raise for about 150 million Americans. For self-employed workers who pay both the employer and employee side of the withholding, it would have meant a 12.4% increase in take-home pay. At a time when consumer spending was weak, it would have improved the bottom line for millions of companies as well. Finally, Mosler recognized the profound strain that the recession had on state and local government budgets. To help these currency-using governments weather the sharp decline in tax revenues, he proposed $500 billion in aid distributed on a per capita basis to all 50 states the District of Columbia, and U.S. island territories. That would have protected tens of thousands of teachers, firefighters, police, and other public sector workers whose jobs are on the line as state revenues dried up. And by the way, uh, many of those, perhaps a majority of the teachers, the firefighters, the police, and other public sector workers lost their jobs as a result of the recession, at least temporarily, because there wasn't the aid to local governments that came out of the stimulus package that was passed. In fact, Warren Mosler's stimulus package probably would have cost not much more than $1 trillion, okay, at that point. And unlike the $787 billion stimulus package that was passed in the ARRA by the Obama administration, it would have ended the recession, the Great Recession, within 6 months. That was the estimate by Warren. And I checked that out, thought about it for a long time. I believe Warren was right, because that would have instantly restored full employment to the economy. And most of those foreclosures would never have happened. The housing market would have been quickly restored. It had actually started to collapse in 2007 already, but it would have been quickly restored if that had been passed. Okay, and then a Medicare for All bill immediately followed it. Certainly, those two things together would have ended the recession in 2009. As it was, it's arguably true that it never really has ended to this day. To this day. Anyway, when we walked into the Congressman's West 31st Street office, the fiscal deficit stood at $1.4 trillion. Lawmakers were in full panic mode. The Congressional Budget Office had just published its long-term budget outlook, opening the report with the following sentence, quote, "Recently, the federal government has been recording the largest budget deficits as a share of the economy since the end of World War II. If nothing was done to stem the tide of red ink," the report continued, "high debt would increase the probability of a fiscal crisis in which investors would lose confidence in the government's ability to manage its budget, and the government would be forced to pay much more to borrow money." Well, as you know from earlier chapters in this book, CBO was quite wrong about that. The interest rates could have been and were, in the event, entirely controlled by the combination of the Treasury Department coordinating with the Federal Reserve, and the cost to borrow money never did increase during that period. To address the perceived fiscal crisis, President Obama created a bipartisan commission. That was what I previously called the Fiscal Commission, the Cat Food Commission, the BS Commission, that is the Bowles-Simpson Commission, created a bipartisan commission and tasked it with finding ways to substantially reduce the deficit. Warren Mosler and I were there to encourage Cleaver to embrace a set of policies that would increase the deficit, at least temporarily. The congressman greeted us and invited us to sit. He smiled warmly as he settled into his plush executive chair behind an impressive wooden desk. Warren began by explaining he wasn't worried about the CBO report or the federal government's ability to sustain federal fiscal deficits, however large they might become. The issue of the currency could never run out of money. Thanks, honey. Excuse me. The issue of the currency could never run out of money, as President Obama had once claimed. What was needed, Mosler explained, was an ambitious mix of well-targeted tax cuts and additional spending to restore growth and usher in a new era of prosperity. The well-targeted tax cuts Warren was talking about, of course, was the Social Security payroll tax cuts, which were known to have a fiscal multiplier, a primary fiscal multiplier at the time of 1.33, healthier than most of the rest of what was done in the stimulus bill. Cleaver wasn't buying it. The United States was broke. Where was Congress going to find the money to carry out Mosler's proposal? The deficit was already sky high, and everyone in Congress was looking for ways to raise revenue and cut spending. And Stephanie says, I could tell he felt like the victim of some bad practical joke. I watched as he squirmed uncomfortably in that oversized chair. The whole conversation ran much like the chapters of this book. Point by point, Warren took Cleaver through a yawning narrative that began with the government imposing a tax in order to provision itself and ended with an explanation about why, contrary to popular belief, Social Security wasn't, quote, going broke, unquote. I could tell that it was an excruciating experience for Cleaver. His body language said it all. For nearly 45 minutes, he shifted anxiously in that big chair. He interrupted only once or twice, and only to have Mosler respond that he had missed an essential part of the argument. He winced as if experiencing physical pain, as Mosler explained that the purpose of collecting taxes is to regulate inflation, that we never need to retire the national debt, and that we should think of exports as real costs and imports as real benefits. I knew exactly how Manny Cleaver was feeling because I had had the same emotional response when I first encountered Mosler in the mid-1990s. I had also experienced what came next. With only a few minutes remaining in an hour-long scheduled meeting, it happened. The Copernican moment. I recognized it immediately. Mosler's words had clicked. It was the breakthrough we had hoped for. For the first time, the congressman was seeing the world through an MMT lens, and things had just come into focus. From that moment, his entire demeanor changed. His eyes widened. His posture became confident. And then he leaned forward, clasped his hands, looked Warren in the eye, and softly said, quote, I can't say that, unquote. Stephanie goes on, I've thought back on that conversation at least 100 times. What was he afraid of? Why should a more realistic story about money, taxes, and debt be so unspeakable? There's a passage in the Bible, John 8:32, where Jesus finishes a speech at the temple by telling his listeners, quote, the truth will set you free, unquote. Reverend Cleaver had probably preached that verse to his own congregation at St. James United Methodist Church. But with us, on that summer day, while millions of Americans struggled to find work or fend off foreclosure on their homes, he decided that the truth could not be spoken, at least not by him. Congressman Cleaver is a man of faith, but he's also a man of reason, working in a political arena that is thoroughly saturated by deficit myths. He might have been persuaded by Mosler's message, but he was not going to become a messenger. It was just too risky. That's because there is only one acceptable way to talk about money, taxes, and the national debt, especially in and around Washington, D.C. Taxes raise revenue for Uncle Sam, and it's taxpayer money that funds our government. Borrowing drives a nation into debt, which burdens our kids and grandkids. You can safely utter any of these phrases, and you will come across as a serious intellectual. but stray from the conventional wisdom and you'll be sidelined by an inner circle of self-proclaimed budget wonks, lawmakers, and congressional staffers who wittingly or unwittingly spread the deficit myth. Preaching the virtues of fiscal restraint is always a safe play. Challenging these articles of faith is heretical. Cleaver understood that. MMT is not a religion, says Steph, and it's not looking for disciples to follow some screed. What it offers is a realistic description of how a modern fiat currency works, along with some prescriptive ideas about how to transform that understanding into better public policy by helping us to see more clearly what the obstacles are, e.g., inflation, and aren't, e.g., running out of money. MMT opens the door to a new way of thinking about how we could run our economy. In almost all cases, it shows us that we have allowed myths and understandings about money, debt, and taxes to hold us back. By tearing down these myths, MMT shows us that it's possible to build a stronger and more secure future for ourselves, our global partners, and our future generations. So how do we get there? Stephanie then says, I believe Congressman Cleaver is a good person. He wants what's best for his district and his country. After our meeting, he realized that Congress had the power to do much more, even if the CBO and the Beltway pundits were preaching gloom and doom over the budget outlook. But he's just one person, and while his status as an elected member of Congress may appear to give him more power than the rest of us, he felt powerless in that particular moment. His hands were tied by the deficit myth's stranglehold on our public discourse. For that to change, the public's understanding of the economy has to change. No member of Congress is going to bring about that change. We are. It's like my former boss, Bernie Sanders, always says, quote, change never comes from the top down, it always comes from the bottom up, unquote. If we're going to take advantage of the policy space that MMT opens up, it's going to be because enough of us, readers like you, help to shift the public debate in a new direction. Through the MMT lens, we can see an alternative and more hopeful set of possibilities. It's our future, it's our economy, and it's our monetary system. We can make it work for us. Then Stephanie moves to talk about the descriptive side of MMT. Now, I want to point out at this point, if Stephanie talks about the descriptive side, okay, of MMT, then she must also think there's at least one other side, okay, of MMT, and maybe more. And later on, she does talk about the prescriptive side, okay, of MMT. But let's hold that for a minute. Even though, she says, we're talking about how to act on the insights of MMT, I don't want you to think of MMT as something every government needs to adopt or implement. MMT does not come with a prepackaged set of policies to be rolled out across the global landscape. It is first and foremost a description of how a modern fiat currency works. Okay, but again, that's not all it is. It is first and foremost a description. But that's not all it is. That's the implication. With an improved understanding of the monetary system comes the ability to distinguish artificial barriers from legitimate constraints. The descriptive side of MMT is about helping us break free of the myths and misunderstandings that have been holding us back. Getting an accurate picture of how the monetary system works is a necessary first step towards building an economy that works for all people. Reaching that better world will require moving beyond the descriptive side of MMT to its prescriptive policy-making side. So there is a policy-making side, which is also part of MMT. That necessarily means asking what role we want our public institutions, for example, Congress and the Federal Reserve, to play in supporting a policy agenda that advances our collective interests. The descriptive aspect is like a doctor's diagnostic toolkit. Before medical interns can prescribe a course of treatment to an ailing patient, they must first establish a working knowledge of how the body functions. That means learning about the circulatory system, the digestive system, the nervous system, and so on. Only after interns have demonstrated competence in their understanding of how the human body works do we allow them to become doctors and write prescriptions for patients. The problem we have today is that economic policy is often prescribed by people who, despite holding advanced degrees in economics, possess no real understanding of how our monetary system works. By offering a better descriptive framework, MMT helps us to see a wider array of policy treatments that could make our economy stronger and healthier. But the idea has to occur by this point. The question has to be raised. Are there policies that are core to MMT? Is there a prescriptive minimum that is core to MMT? Okay. Apart from the descriptive side, an MMT view of the monetary system changes the way we think about what it means for currency issuing nations to, quote, live within their means, unquote. It asks us to think in terms of real resource constraints, inflation, rather than perceived financial constraints. It teaches us to ask not, quote, how will you pay for it, unquote, but, quote, how will you resource it, unquote. It shows us that if we have the technological know-how and the available resources, the people, the factories, the equipment, and the raw materials to put a man on the moon or embark on a Green New Deal to tackle climate change, then funding to carry out those missions can always be made available. Coming up with the money is the easy part. Yes, indeed, it is the easy part. Managing the inflation risk is the critical challenge. Not just managing the inflation risk, but resourcing what you need to resource in order to accomplish your goals. The previous chapter set goals as closing those value gaps, the 7 major deficits that matter. Specific resources need to be made available to close those gaps. If we don't close them in a proper way, then we will have a higher inflation risk than we should have. But the inflation risk is the outcome of resourcing things improperly. Going on, more than any other economic approach, MMT places inflation at the center of the debate over spending limits. It also offers a more sophisticated array of techniques for managing inflation pressures than what we have today. What MMT describes is the reality of our post-Bretton Woods monetary system. We're no longer on a gold standard, and yet much of our political discourse is still rooted in that outmoded way of thinking. We see it every time a reporter asks a question. Where will you find the money to do that? It's long past time we came to grips with what it means to be the issuer of a sovereign fiat currency. For the currency issuer, money is no object, one of Stephanie's favorite sayings. money is no object. Literally or figuratively, it doesn't exist in some scarce physical form like gold that the government needs to find in order to spend. It is conjured into existence from a computer keyboard each time the Federal Reserve carries out an authorized payment on behalf of the Treasury. That is strictly correct. It's conjured into existence in the private sector. Wasn't in the private sector before, but it is conjured into existence in the private sector from a computer keyboard each time the Federal Reserve carries out an authorized payment on behalf of the Treasury. That might sound like a free lunch. It isn't. MMT isn't a blank check. It doesn't grant us carte blanche when it comes to funding new programs. And it's not a plot to grow the size of government. As an analytical framework, MMT is about identifying the untapped potential in our economy, what we call our fiscal space, what's also been called our policy space. If there are millions of people looking for paid work and our economy has the capacity to produce more goods and services without raising prices, then we have the fiscal space to bring those resources into productive employment. How we choose to utilize that fiscal space is a political matter. And here, MMT can be used to defend policies that are traditionally more liberal. Medicare for all, free college, or middle class tax cuts, or more conservative, e.g., military spending or corporate tax cuts. Now, I really don't think that MMT can be used to defend corporate tax cuts very easily. And the reason for that, I believe, is that the overall goal of MMT is actually public purpose. And what is public purpose? Well, it's a little different for everyone. And the public purpose we should seek to maximize should be the public purpose as we see it in our democracy, as the people see the the public purpose. But Stephanie herself, in chapter 7, began to define what she thinks is the public purpose by talking about the deficits that matter and the importance of closing those deficits. We achieve the public purpose, I believe, for her when we close those particular deficits. Then she goes on. The point is that we run our economy like a 6-foot tall guy who wanders around perpetually hunched over in a house with 8-foot ceilings because someone convinced him that if he tries to stand tall, he'll suffer a massive head trauma. For too many years, we've been crouching down. We could have been standing strong. Irrational fears about government debts and fiscal deficits caused policymakers in the US, Japan, the UK, and elsewhere to pivot away from fiscal stimulus towards austerity in the years following the global financial crisis. This forced immeasurable pain on tens, if not hundreds of millions worldwide. Populist movements on both the left and the right found inspiration in these failings. Not everything can be fixed through a more generous application of the federal budget. Austerity has exacerbated many of our social and economic problems, but budget cuts are not the sole drivers of stagnation and rising inequality. Restoring economic security to the working class will require tackling monopoly power, sweeping reforms to our tax codes, labor laws, and trade and housing policies, and more. So keep that in mind. Restoring economic security to the working class will require tackling monopoly power, sweeping reforms to our tax codes, labor laws, and trade and housing policies, and more. Question: how does that relate to the 7 deficits that matter? It isn't clear yet in this chapter. It will also require a new economic model. We must end the cruel and inefficient practice of relying on democratically unaccountable central bankers to target the right mix of inflation and unemployment. I entirely agree. I also note that if we ended this practice, we would be partly closing the democracy deficit that Stephanie identified in Chapter 7. To build an economy for the people, responsibility for maintaining employment and income security must become the responsibility of elected representatives of the people. I'd point out it is their responsibility now because it has the power of Article 1, Section 8, but it has turned over that responsibility in large part to the Federal Reserve. It gave up that responsibility to an undemocratic institution that it created as an undemocratic institution, unaccountable to the people in a direct way. Congress, with its great power over the federal budget, must play an active and permanent role in stabilizing output and employment through time. Now, there are a lot of economists that disagree with that kind of prescription. There are many people who claim to be MMTers who disagree with that kind of prescription. They want to give more power to the Federal Reserve to manage the economy because they do not trust the Congress. My own view, and I believe Stephanie's, okay, as indicated here, is that we not only ought to trust the Congress, but we must trust the Congress because the structure of our government is such that we are supposed to exercise our own power, the power of the people, through the Congress and through the executive branch, primarily. We can't have those branches turning power over to agencies that, are unelected and then subscribing to a doctrine basically saying that these experts must be unaccountable. We must leave them to do their jobs. That is anti-democratic. It subverts the democracy. It creates a greater democracy deficit. Now, saying that Congress must be more active, that's already prescriptive. That's already a prescriptive side to MMT. But Stephanie has that in the descriptive section. We must recognize that what she's saying here is that the trust that has been deposited in the Federal Reserve to do most of the management of the economy is misplaced and has to end. And that one prescription, okay, of MMT is that to fix the democracy deficit, that has to be changed. The Federal Reserve, by its very nature, as presently constituted, cannot have that power. Now, perhaps it could have that power if it were reorganized and placed within the executive branch and made directly accountable to the President of the United States. And we also changed our system of election of the President of the United States so that president was popularly elected by a majority of the people. Maybe that would change things in healing the democracy deficit. But those are the kinds of things that have to be done. But the next section moves to the prescriptive side of MMT. Recall Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man principle, that, quote, with great power there must also come great responsibility, unquote. The prescriptive side of MMT moves us beyond the looking glass into a conversation about what fiscal and monetary policy might look like in an MMT-informed world. MMT urges us to demote monetary policy, at least in its current form, and elevate fiscal policy as the primary tool for macroeconomic stabilization. That is a prescription, okay, of MMT. It is a prescription justified by the desire to heal the democracy deficit, as well as some of the other deficits, like good jobs and closing the savings gap. And coping with the climate crisis. In fact, it's important for closing all the various gaps because the Federal Reserve cannot do that in its current form. The system of monetary policy is impotent to do that. Fiscal policy must be used if we want to close those gaps. Congress holds the power of the purse, and we need to harness that power to build an economy that works for all of us. I know what you're thinking. Can we really trust the government with that kind of power? My answer is yes and no. My answer is yes. We have no alternative if we want a democracy. We must trust the government with that kind of power, but we also must ourselves check that government constantly with the power of the people. Stephanie says, I say yes, because we the people have already entrusted them with that power. MMT doesn't give Congress any new authority over our monetary system. We have a democratically elected government that unshackled itself from the gold standard nearly a century ago. Okay, the decision that gave Congress unfettered access to the public purse. Having the power of the purse means never having to ask, where will we find the money to cut taxes or spend trillions on endless wars? Congress just needs to find enough votes and voila, the money will be there. Today, the federal budget is about $4.5 trillion, roughly 20% of total GDP. If it wants to, Congress can write a $5 trillion budget or a $6 trillion budget, or even more. It can pour trillions into education, infrastructure, healthcare, and housing. Any amount of spending that is authorized by Congress will take place. The Federal Reserve's elaborate network of primary dealers is there to guarantee it. Or if you don't want to use the primary dealers, and you don't want to issue debt, you could mint the platinum coins. Or Congress could order the Federal Reserve to to place the necessary reserves to do congressional spending upon the passage of every appropriations bill. That's called overt congressional financing. That is the reality of the STAB model, the STAB model, which decouples spending from the prior need to raise money by taxing or borrowing. The question is, how do we want the federal government to use its great power? How much should it spend? What should it fund? What about inflation and taxes? Can we trust Congress to make the right choices at the right time, making productive investments when there is fiscal space and exercising the necessary restraint as resources become scarce? Perhaps I'm too cynical, but I'd like some kind of insurance policy. I'd like some kind of insurance policy too, but I believe the ultimate insurance policy, I'm not opposing other kinds of insurance policies, but the ultimate insurance policy is a much more active populace than we have now. Activist participation in government policy from the bottom up continuously. That was Bernie Sanders' message, and it was the right message. Our revolution, not me, us. There are two parts to the federal budget. There's the discretionary part, over which Congress has, discretion to change the amount of money it puts into existing or new programs each year. Most of the money that gets spent on defense, education, environmental protection, and transportation comes from annual discretionary budget appropriations. But there's also a non-discretionary or mandatory part, which is more or less preordained by statutory criteria. Well, maybe, but the question is it more or is it less? Spending on programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid fall under this category. But as we know, Social Security still has to be appropriated by Congress. The appropriations are not automatic. And if they're not automatic, they're maybe less mandatory? Maybe less non-discretionary? Anyway, unemployment insurance, supplemental nutrition assistance program, that may be mandatory, but Congress has been having a hell of a good time cutting it. SNAP, formerly food stamps, interest on U.S. treasuries, and student loans are also binding commitments that cause spending to rise or fall independent of congressional action. I'd qualify that, say, somewhat independently of congressional action. When someone becomes disabled, retires, loses a job, turns 65, invests in U.S. treasuries, or takes out a federal student loan, federal dollars are automatically released to meet those expenditures. In total, the mandatory spending accounts for just over 60% of federal expenditures, and interest accounts for nearly 10%. That means that 70% of the federal budget is essentially on autopilot, leaving just 30% under the discretionary control of lawmakers. Of course, with enough votes, Congress has the power to change any part of the budget. It could stop issuing treasuries and leave it to the Federal Reserve to supply interest-bearing securities. Over time, that would completely eliminate interest expenditure from the federal budget. It could vote to pass a single-payer Medicare for All bill that would substantially increase mandatory spending while saving the rest of us trillions over time. Or it could simply appropriate more discretionary funding for things like transportation and education. As we learned in the first chapter of this book, Congress is a legal body with the power to suspend or modify any self-imposed constraint, e.g., pay-go, the Byrd Rule, or the debt ceiling, Section 302A allocation, no overdraft, etc. That might otherwise prevent lawmakers from appropriating funding or stop the Federal Reserve from clearing authorized payments on behalf of the Treasury. Even the CBO and the House and Senate budget committees, which were themselves created through an act of Congress in 1974, could be dissolved or instructed to follow new protocols. And of course, the Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress with a mandate that is subject to change and a structure that is subject to change. Before we get to a discussion about how policymaking might improve in an MMT-informed world, let me share a couple of stories that illustrate the dysfunctional way we do things today. One of the first things I remember after becoming chief economist to the Democrats on the Senate Budget Committee was a meeting to discuss the proposed $1 trillion infrastructure bill. A dozen or so senior staffers gathered around a large conference table on the third floor of the Dirksen Senate office building. No one questioned the significant need for infrastructure investment. $1 trillion while ambitious, would have only taken a bite out of the problem. No one blanched at the price tag, but there was considerable debate about whether and how to pay for it. Before I tell you about that debate, it's important to understand what these words mean to lawmakers and their staffers on Capitol Hill. In truth, there is only one way to pay for anything. All federal spending is carried out in exactly the same way. That is, the Federal Reserve credits the appropriate bank accounts. But in Washington speak, you, quote, pay for, unquote, your spending by showing that you can, quote, find, unquote, enough money to cover the cost of what it is you're proposing to spend. It's all a game, really, and it's rooted in the flawed mental model, TABS, that holds back so much of our potential. To avoid adding to the deficit, lawmakers look for ways to cover the costs of their proposed spending without borrowing. That usually means they go looking for new tax revenue. So back to the debate over the $1 trillion infrastructure bill. The conversation began with staffers being asked about whether we thought a so-called pay for should be attached to the bill. It was my first week on the job, so I was relieved when another staffer spoke up first. No, this person began. Quote, I think we should just do it as a clean bill, unquote. I suspect that other staffer was Matthew Stoller, but that's just a guess. A clean bill meant writing a spending bill that didn't include any language about how to pay for it. Another staffer agreed, and soon I echoed their sentiments. Our country desperately needed to make these investments. There was clearly enough fiscal space to do it, and infrastructure, one of the things that has traditionally enjoyed bipartisan support. Since the GOP was in control of the Senate, we reasoned the bill would need at least some support from Republicans to pass. Proposing a tax increase would guarantee defeat. Not everyone agreed. Another staffer objected that the press wouldn't take the legislation seriously unless it specified exactly how it would be paid for. I guess that staffer was Jeff Weaver. In the end, the bill included a proposal to raise revenue by closing a variety of tax loopholes. By the way, that's pure speculation. The bill included a proposal to raise revenue by closing a variety of tax loopholes that overwhelmingly benefit the rich. Needless to say, that legislation did not pass. Meanwhile, the latest Association of the Society for Civil Engineers report card shows how deferred maintenance is catching up with us as the cost of our needed improvements has climbed to a whopping $4.59 trillion. Sometimes lawmakers are willing to look the other way and vote to authorize spending without worrying about where the money will come from. Take defense spending, for example. Each year, Congress votes to approve a defense bill. In 2017, A 1,215-page bill known as the National Defense Authorization Act. By the way, I want to point out about that particular act. It may well have been a combined authorization and appropriations bill, not just an authorization bill. They often are two bills, one an authorization bill and the other an appropriations bill. The money bill is the appropriations bill. The authorization bill authorizes that such and such an amount of money will be appropriated, but it doesn't mean Congress will follow through with an appropriations bill. So in this case, it may well have been a combined bill carrying both the authorization and the appropriation. Sailed through the Senate with a vote of 89-9. The White House had requested $700 billion, but the Senate authorized $737 billion, kicking in an extra $37 billion without a hint of concern about where to, quote, find, unquote, the money. They simply voted in an overwhelmingly bipartisan way to increase the Pentagon's discretionary budget. That might seem like a double standard, as Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put it, quote, "We write unlimited blank checks for war. We just wrote a $2 trillion check for that tax, the GOP tax cut, and nobody asked those folks, quote, how are they going to pay for it, unquote." She's right. Somehow there's always money for war and tax cuts for just about everything else. However, lawmakers are expected to show they can, quote, pay for, unquote, their spending, at least on paper. With 535 members of Congress, 100 in the Senate, 435 in the House of Representatives, this requires a steady stream of new funding options. During my time in the Senate, I learned about a one-stop shop that was created to provide lawmakers with ready access to a litany of so-called pay-fors. If a congressman needed to find $10 billion, $50 billion, $500 billion or more, Calvin Johnson had you covered. For years, Johnson, a professor of corporate and business law at the University of Texas Law School, helped to run something called the Shelf Project. Together, Johnson and other tax experts assembled a collection of, quote, proposals that can be pulled off the shelf when Congress is ready to raise revenue, unquote. Johnson's testimony before the Senate Committee on Finance in 2050 was titled 50 Ways to Raise $1 Trillion, unquote. In the summer, when lawmakers returned home to their districts, the binders mostly sat on the shelves gathering dust. But when Congress was in session and someone needed a plausible pay-for to attach to some piece of legislation, Johnson's phone was under constant pressure. He and his colleagues were deeply passionate about their work. They weren't cobbling together proposals simply for the sake of helping lawmakers jump through the pay-for hoop. For them, the project was about identifying ways to make the tax system fairer and more efficient. But in the eyes of many staffers, the Shelf Project was sort of like a filing cabinet in the fraternity house, where folders containing hundreds of old midterm exams are stored. In other words, it's where you go to cheat your way around obstacles like pay-go. Shopping for pay-fors went something like this, quote, "Hi, I'm a staffer in Senator X's office. The senator needs $350 billion over 10 years. What have you got?" unquote. Johnson might recommend a single change to some part of the tax code that would raise the full $350 billion. Or he might pull down a few binders that together would generate the full amount. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The goal was to find your boss enough revenue to play the game. My own impression is that nearly everyone in Congress has at least some sense of how crazy the pay-for game is. I first realized this in 2015 during Votorama Week. Votorama is a frenzied circus during which all 100 senators assembled to cast rapid-fire votes on a plethora of non-binding budget amendments. One after another, senators rise to urge their colleagues to vote in support of their, quote, deficit neutral, unquote, amendment to expand Social Security, cut taxes, raise the minimum wage, and so on. I watched part of it from the back benches on the Senate floor, and I remember laughing after hearing California Senator Barbara Boxer tell one of our colleagues, quote, I voted for your amendment even though your pay for is bullshit, unquote. I couldn't have said it better myself, says Stephanie. Her point, Barbara Boxer's, was a simple one. We've got a really screwy way of drafting, evaluating, and passing legislation. We pretend that the federal government needs to budget like a household. We think of taxes as something the government needs, i.e. revenue, instead of remembering that taxes are there to subtract spending power from the rest of us so that the government's own spending doesn't push the economy beyond its full employment limit. We hamstring legislation by demanding the government pay for new spending even when the economy could safely absorb that spending without the need for higher taxes. And we do all of this because we've decided that these household budgeting practices somehow serve the public interest. They don't. What would it look like if the government overcame the deficit myths and started budgeting like a currency issuer instead of pretending that it needs to pay for its spending just like the rest of us? It might feel like the myths are there to protect us from politicians who would otherwise spend too much and tax too little. There may be some truth to that, but the bigger problem is they also prevent us from spending enough. Somewhere between excessive spending and unwarranted fiscal restraint lies a better economy for all. To build that economy, we need a new plan. So what's the MMT prescription? Is there a way to improve the well-being of our people without pushing things too far? Can fiscal policy really take over the economic steering wheel? What's left for monetary policy? Transferring the economic steering wheel to the fiscal authority means relying on democratically elected members of Congress to relax the purse strings when bigger deficits can help support the economy and then tighten them back up as the economy reaches its full employment speed limit. This is the essence of the functional finance approach that was pioneered by Abba P. Lerner in the 1940s. Instead of obsessing over deficits and trying to force the budget into balance, Lerner wanted lawmakers to write a budget that would keep the economy in balance at full employment. MMT draws inspiration from Lerner's work, but with the caveat that we need to do more than simply ask Congress to take over the steering wheel from the Federal Reserve. We need to offer some guiding principles to help lawmakers wield this power responsibly and in ways that serve the broader public good. For that, we'll need to establish some new guardrails, and we'll need to provide lawmakers with clearly marked speed limits, a dashboard of indicators, and a driverless feature that takes over much of the steering. That way, fiscal policy can serve as a powerful stabilizing force even when our politics are at their most dysfunctional. The next section is mandatory driverless spending. Stephanie says, today we rely on monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, to actively dial interest rates up and down in an effort to discover the invisible Nairu that is supposed to keep the economy on an even keel. You remember the Nairu, the non-accelerating inflation rate, of unemployment. Now, we debated about whether there was such a thing earlier in reviewing the book, and I think most of us decided there's no such thing. But anyway, to discover the invisible Nairu that's supposed to keep the economy on an even keel. MMT considers fiscal policy a more potent stabilizer and one that can be used to target even broader measures of well-being. Lerner agreed that fiscal policy should sit in the driver's seat, but he assumed we could just hand over the keys and leave it up to Congress to figure out how to work the economic steering wheel. Yeah, with people like Louis Gumpert in the Congress, that doesn't seem like a good idea. In contrast, MMT wants to make sure that both the car and the driver are well equipped to steer fiscal policy in a responsible direction. Congress will always have the power to take discretionary action, but in an increasingly polarized political climate, we should make sure to handle a hands free feature as well. That way, fiscal policy will respond to changing economic conditions even when Congress is unwilling to act. Call it an insurance policy. Having part of the budget respond automatically to changing road conditions is critically important. It's what actually prevented the Great Recession from developing into a second Great Depression. Yes, there was discretionary legislation. Congress passed the 787 billion American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the ARA, in February 2009. But what really saved us were the fiscal adjustments that occurred automatically without any need for legislative action. The New Deal adjustments, the safety net adjustments going on. Those adjustments happened because of mechanisms known as automatic stabilizers, which are built into the government budget, built in by Franklin Roosevelt and his successors. They work like shock absorbers in your car. In good driving conditions, you hardly notice them. But when the road gets bumpy, they make all the difference. When the economy hit its rough patch in 2008, the automatic stabilizers created a driverless fiscal response that helped to cushion the blow. Taxes fell off a cliff as millions of Americans lost their jobs and business struggled to stay afloat. When taxes fall off a cliff, of course, less money is being taken away from the American people at just the time when they can't afford any money to be taken away from them. At the same time, spending rose sharply, spending by the government, because millions of people automatically received support through unemployment insurance, food stamps, Medicaid, and other safety net programs. The result was a sudden spike in the fiscal deficit, one that added more than 1.4 trillion to the non-government bucket in 2009. And if you look at the sectoral financial balances in that year and you break things down to the household sector, you will find that suddenly in 2009, household savings spiked up high. And that was the first year in which household savings spiked up high for a number of years. Household balance sheets were being repaired by those big fiscal deficits that everybody was so alarmed about. That CBO was going crazy about that. But that red ink that poured from Uncle Sam's bucket, in Stephanie's words, turned black as it entered the buckets of millions of struggling families and business. Looking back on this dynamic, Paul Krugman wrote, "That's an interesting way to think about what has happened, and it also suggests a startling conclusion, namely government deficits, mainly the result of automatic stabilizers rather than discretionary policy, are the only thing that saved us from a second Great Depression. Although they saved us from a darker fate," says Stephanie, "the automatic stabilizers weren't strong enough to prevent an enormously painful recession. It took 7 years to claw back all the jobs that were lost in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Millions lost their homes. Some even lost their lives as a direct consequence of long-term unemployment. As the journalist Jeff Spross, he writes at The Week, put it, quote, the damage done by long-term joblessness to mental and physical health is rivaled only by the death of a spouse, unquote. That's true. the damage done by long-term joblessness. Something that could have been cured almost immediately if Manny Cleaver and the rest of the Congress had listened to Warren Mosler in 2010 and earlier, because the prescriptions were available in 2009. If Congress had listened and had passed Mosler's program, there would have been no damage done by long-term joblessness to mental and physical health. To better protect our economy, and more importantly, the people, families, and communities in it, MMT recommends the addition of a powerful new automatic stabilizer known as a federal job guarantee. We first encountered the idea in Chapter 2, where it was shown that we could achieve genuine full employment, a job for every person who wants one. Today, the Federal Reserve defines full employment as a level of unemployment that leaves millions locked in a game of musical chairs, searching for jobs that don't exist. MMT resolves the problem by directly funding employment for those without work, because it's a driverless stabilizer. The steering wheel will always turn in the right direction at the right moment in time. To understand the economic logic behind the job guarantee, think back to Chapter 1 and the story of Warren Mosler's business cards. Remember that Mosler wanted a tidy house, clean cards, and a nicely manicured yard. To get these things, he subjected his kids to a tax, payable only in his own business cards. The purpose of the tax was to motivate the kids to perform the work that was required to earn the cards. Similarly, when a government demands that taxes and other obligations be paid in its own unique currency, e.g. the US dollar, it does so to motivate people to spend some of their time working to get the currency. It might want a standing army, a court system, public parks, hospitals, bridges, and so on. Unemployment is defined as people seeking paid work in the government's unit of account, in our case, the dollar. The US dollar is basically a tax credit, says Warren Mosler and Stephanie here. MMT is the only macroeconomic approach that understands this, and the job guarantee follows directly from this understanding. Once you realize this, it becomes clear that any currency issuing government has the power to eliminate domestic unemployment simply by offering to hire the unemployed. If it decides not to exercise this power, then it is choosing the unemployment rate. As of this writing, the official unemployment rate, 3.5%, is low by historical standards. A broader measure of unemployment, one that comes closer to capturing the true extent of the problem, is nearly twice as high, 6.5%. I would have argued it's higher than that, because the U6 doesn't capture disemployment. A lot of people who want jobs but have given up looking. This measure, known as U6 by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, tells us there are nearly 12 million Americans looking for a way to earn more currency, but the jobs just aren't there. The government could hire them all, and could have hired an additional 8 million that would have been available if the job guarantee had been in effect, but who were recorded as having dropped out of the workforce, as not available to work. Currently, the federal government chooses not to do that. Instead, it provides unemployment insurance as a way to cushion incomes when people lose jobs. Assuming workers qualify to receive benefits, unemployment insurance replaces a portion of the wages that are lost when someone becomes unemployed. The average payout is $347 per week. It should be noted that even at The low rate, I believe, of $15 per hour, which is what people are talking about these days, and I think that's quite inadequate. That comes 40-hour week, $15 an hour, that comes to $600 per week, nearly double what unemployment insurance is. This helps to cushion the economy when aggregate demand begins to fall off, but it doesn't protect the worker from a bout of joblessness. No, it doesn't. Some find new jobs relatively quickly, while others will languish among the ranks of the unemployed for months or even years. In a deep recession, many will experience long term unemployment, eventually seeing their benefits run out and their skills atrophy. While unemployment insurance is considered the most important automatic stabilizer we have today, it is not the most powerful stabilizer we can design. Part of the problem is that not everyone who is unemployed is eligible to receive benefits. That's because not all work is covered by unemployment insurance. Some people are ineligible because they quit their jobs or are terminated for misconduct. Others aren't employed long enough to qualify, or they have previously exhausted their benefits. Even many eligible workers don't receive benefits. According to the government's Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2018, 77% of the unemployed people who had worked in the previous 12 months had not applied for unemployment insurance benefits since their last job. Of the unemployed who had not applied, 3 out of 5 did not apply because they did not believe they were eligible to receive benefits. The federal job guarantee would eliminate the uncertainty by establishing a universal right of employment to all. Here's how it would work. Instead of leaving millions jobless, the government would establish an open-ended commitment to provide job seekers with access to the currency in exchange for performing public service work. Participation would be purely voluntary. No one is required to work in the program. To ensure we're not just creating make-work jobs, but good jobs, MIT economists have recommended these jobs pay a living wage and that the work itself should serve a useful public purpose. And just to look at footnote 25, it is not a make-work scheme. Many of the jobs could resemble those created under the New Deal programs of the 1930s. For example, many public works projects undertaken through the Works Progress Administration. A lot of environmental work was performed under the Civilian Conservation Corps, and part-time jobs were created for 1.5 million high school students and 600,000 college students under the National Youth Administration. In contrast to many of the Roosevelt-era New Deal programs, which excluded blacks and other minority groups from participating, the job guarantee would ensure universal access to all. Here's how it would work. Instead of leaving millions I read that already. So, since the job guarantee would establish a permanent commitment, it would become a mandatory as opposed to a discretionary federal spending program. As with other mandatory programs, for example, unemployment insurance or food stamps, spending would bounce up and down as people enter and exit the program. By the way, that is not a bug. That is a feature. That is the economic stabilization feature. When the economy goes down and a lot of people are thrown out of work, they go to the job guarantee program. Spending bounces up, and the job guarantee program cushions the economy against the fall. If the economy slips into recession, more people will transition into public service employment, and the budget will automatically register higher spending to support those jobs. When the economy improves and the private sector is ready to begin hiring again, workers will move out of the program and the budget will automatically shrink. This makes the job guarantee a powerful new automatic stabilizer, one that would fortify the existing driverless mechanisms in the federal budget. I am very much for the job guarantee program. Okay. Of course, I have to emphasize, though, that MMT economists have recommended that these jobs pay a living wage. Now, Bernie Sanders keeps talking about a living wage, $15 an hour. $15 an hour is not necessarily a living wage. It may these days be a living wage only in the poorest areas of the United States. I suggest that MMT economists and policymakers who adhere to MMT want to implement MMT solutions that work, take seriously that this has to be a living wage. To ensure that it is a living wage in each area in the United States, what needs to be done is to take the lowest cost area in the United States, find out what a living wage is in that lowest cost area as measured by something like the CPI, make that the lowest living wage in the United States, and then cost adjust that living wage for each CPI area within the United States. So, for example, if $15 an hour was a living wage in the lowest cost area in the United States, then doing CPI adjustments might result in a living wage of $30 an hour in the highest cost area in the United States. So be it. Remember, there's no barrier to paying for the job guarantee program. Doesn't matter how much it costs. If it does the job of providing full employment at a living wage, it solves the good jobs problem. That's what we're looking to do here, to close that gap, solve the good jobs problem. So, from a purely economic standpoint, the major advantage of the job guarantee is its ability to stabilize employment over the business cycle. This doesn't just benefit those who are able to quickly find new jobs, it benefits all of us. As of 2020, the U.S. is in the midst of the longest expansion that is uninterrupted job growth in recorded history. Of course, since these words were written, that is no longer true due to the reaction to the coronavirus, to COVID-19. We are now at the end of the longest expansion in recorded history. It's gone. Now we have an unprecedented rise in the unemployment rate. We have a rise that's likely to approach the levels of the Depression of the 30s. We'll know soon, but don't be at all surprised if the unemployment rate is suddenly at 25% one of these months. But at some point, the expansion will come to an end. The economy will slip into recession. What would have happened if we had had a job guarantee now? We've had all these people register for unemployment. Nearly 7 million people, then 6 million people, then 5 million people. Now it's 1.5 million people per week. Every week, 1.5, 1.4 million people. It seems to have stabilized at. Every week registering for unemployment. Most of those people would have been registering for a federal job guarantee program. For many of those people, that federal job guarantee program would pay them more than they're working now. And they would be doing useful, valuable work for the community. Businesses hire and invest when they're swamped with customers. That's the nature of capitalism. Eventually, demand will slack off, often because people decide they've taken on too much debt, and people will start to close up their wallets. As customers begin to disappear, Businesses scale back production, begin laying off some of their workers. If we had a job guarantee in place today, it could employ many of the 12 million people who are currently without the work they need. Not the 12 million people who are currently without the work they need. It looks like there are now 40 to 45 million people who are without the work they need. And it could catch many of the people who would otherwise experience unemployment when the next recession comes. It would weave stronger fibers into the existing social safety net, catching people with new employment opportunities the moment they're laid off. Whether you own business or whether you own your own business or work for someone else, your own economic security is probably closely tied to the income security of others. Relying on unemployment insurance isn't good enough. Not everyone is eligible, and most states only pay benefits for 13 to 26 weeks. And in the recent stimulus program, the states weren't even able to process the unemployment applications. They weren't even able to process those because the bureaucracies in the states were paralyzed. They weren't able to handle so many people. People didn't get their benefits for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months. When the Great Recession began, December of 2007, Stephanie says, already 1.3 million people experiencing long-term unemployment more than 27 weeks. In August 2009, after the recession had officially ended, 5 million Americans had been without work for 27 weeks or longer. A year later, that number had climbed to 6.8 million. Even though Congress voted to extend the benefit period, those extensions eventually ended, leaving millions without jobs or income. Businesses and communities across America felt the blow as the unemployed struggled to pay their mortgages. Homes were illegally, she doesn't say illegally here, but homes were illegally foreclosed on using robot signing, illegal robot signing. Property values plummeted. They plummeted also because the banks took over the properties, and they took over the properties and allowed them to fall into disrepair all over the United States. Revenue from property taxes shriveled up. State and local governments slashed spending on everything from education to transportation. Classroom sizes swelled. Infrastructure deteriorated, on and on. The deep and protracted recession hurt us all. And it could have been ended with Warren Mosler's 3 simple policies: the job guarantee, direct aid to states of that $500 billion. I believe it was pegged at $500 per person, okay, per capita, and finally the payroll tax cuts for those who continued to work. And by the way, the payroll tax cuts, of course, would have also applied to people who went into the job guarantee program. Okay, Congress could have pulled the discretionary lever again, authorizing a new round of fiscal stimulus to sustain aggregate demand, but it did not. By that point, lawmakers were more focused on fighting against the budget deficit than allowing bigger deficits to help heal the ailing economy. The austerity idiots, the austerity mongers, the debt terrorists, the Peterson Foundation, the CRBP, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, CRFB, sorry, the crazy Maya McGuinness. Congress left it up to the Federal Reserve to do what it could. That failure to act cost us. It cost all of us. Things would have been very different with a federal job guarantee in place. The economic steering wheel would have automatically turned in the direction of bigger fiscal deficits. Turning the wheel in the direction of even bigger deficits didn't feel right to Congressman Cleaver and his colleagues, but it was exactly what was needed in that moment. Think of it this way. Suppose you're driving through a winter storm and you hit an icy patch that sends your car skidding out of control. What would you do? Instinctively, most of us would probably turn the steering wheel in the opposite direction. If the car is drifting rightward, yanking the wheel to the left just feels like the right thing to do. It isn't. As they teach us in high school, driver's ed class, we need to turn into the skid to regain control. It feels wrong, but it's the only way to avoid a potential collision. The job guarantee equips the federal budget with an automated feature that overrides lawmakers' natural impulse to turn against deficits when the economy is skidding off course. As the economy gets back on track, companies begin hiring workers out of the federal job guarantee program. And when this happens, those workers fall off the government budget and the steering wheel automatically adjusts to reduce the size of the deficits. So the job guarantee is a powerful automatic stabilizer by maintaining incomes and keeping people employed throughout the business cycle. Future recessions would be shorter lasting and less severe. That's because people can enter the program as soon as the economy begins to soften and exit more quickly as hiring conditions improve, since businesses are reluctant to hire people who have been unemployed for long periods of time. Staying employed and building new schools while in the program improves the odds of getting recruited out of the program when the economic tides begin to turn. What kind of work would these people do, and how can we make sure there are always enough jobs available for everyone who wants to work in the program? How much would workers get paid, and who would administer a federal program of this size? Has anything like this been tried before? There's an enormous MMT literature spanning more than 3 decades that answers these questions and many, many more. That's footnote 28, and there it is. See, for example, Michael J. Murray and Matthew Forstetter Eds, Full Employment and Social Justice, book published in 2018. And Michael J. Murray and Matthew Forstetter, The Job Guarantee, and Pavlina Chernyeva, The Case for a Job Guarantee, just coming out probably at 12 o'clock tonight when it turns to June 26th, and William S. Victory, Full Employment and Price Stability, 2004 book, okay, by Edward Elgar, Sources of What Kind of Work. Also, Fidel Kaboob's work is very instructive on what kinds of work could be done by people taking the program, and he has some very nice slide presentations on this. The complete treatment is beyond the scope of this work, but we can answer the big questions and describe the broad contours of the program as laid out in a 2018 report co-authored by 5 MMT economists. That's a Levy report, and the 5 MMT economists were Randy Ray and Pavlina Chernyeva and Stephanie Kelton and Scott Fulweiler, and I believe okay, I've forgotten who the other authors are, but you can look it up, okay, at the Levy Institute. What we envision is a highly decentralized public service employment program that offers paid work at a living wage. And Stephanie says we recommend $15 an hour with a basic package, okay, of benefits that includes health care and paid leave. I've already registered the objection I have to $15 an hour. Both part-time and full-time work should be offered. In other words, I want to stick to a living wage, whatever that turns out to be. Economists can find out what that living wage is. I am sure that in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and Cleveland and Columbus, it ain't $15 an hour. Both part-time, it's not $15 an hour in Ashburn, Virginia, I'll tell you that. Both part-time and full-time work should be offered, and work arrangements should be sufficiently flexible to accommodate the needs of caregivers, students, older workers, those with disabilities, and so on. While funding must come from the top, The jobs themselves would largely be designed by the people living in the communities that will benefit from the work that is performed. That is so key. The jobs will be locally designed. Sorry, screwed that up. Uh, there we go. Sorry, let me get back to where I was. As we explain it in the report, the goal is to create jobs in every community, to create projects beneficial to every community. So it makes sense to involve local communities in these projects from the proposal stage through to implementation, administration, and evaluation. The program budget could reside within the Department of Labor, DOL, and DOL would specify general guidelines for the kinds of projects that would qualify for funding. The goal is to provide jobs that fulfill unmet community needs. As we envision it, all the jobs should be oriented around an overarching goal, building a caring economy. Is that an MMT requirement? I think it is, but I don't know whether Stephanie would want to insist on that. We are an aging society in the midst of a climate crisis with more than enough useful work to be done. We can address our good jobs deficit by creating millions of good paying jobs that care for people, communities, and our planet. When it comes to creating those jobs, we think it's important to recognize the federal government is not in the best position to identify the community's most pressing needs. The people who live and work in the community are. That's why we recommend that government agencies work with community partners to assess and catalog unmet needs so that jobs can be tailored to meet the needs of the community. The needs of the community in the middle K of Appalachia are not the needs of the community in Ashburn, Virginia. Things are different in different places. The program must be tailored by the people who live in the individual places. Together, the states and municipalities would work with their community partners to create a repository of work projects. Think of it like a massively scaled up shelf project, but instead of binders full of pay-fors, the shelves would be filled with a wide variety of available jobs. The idea is to keep the shelves stocked with enough potential work to allow people with different skills and interests to walk in without a job and walk out with one that fits them. By design, the demand for public service jobs will fluctuate over time. On average, we estimate the program would harness the energies of approximately 15 million people. Some will choose part-time work, but most participants will want full-time employment. Suppose we end up with the equivalent of 12 million full-time workers in the program. Assuming 2 weeks of paid leave, that means these people are offering to devote 24 billion hours of time annually to public service employment. Now imagine just some of the things we could accomplish by using 24 billion hours to address tangible deficits in our communities. We could create a 21st century civilian conservation corps, one free of the racist and exclusionary practices of the New Deal era, that puts millions of people to work on projects aimed at caring for the environment. The jobs bank should include a wide variety of available work, ranging from fire prevention to flood control and sustainable agriculture. We could care for blighted communities, which have suffered from decades of neglect and disinvestment, by cleaning up vacant lots, building playgrounds and community gardens, designing after-school programs for young people, and providing apprenticeships and classes for adults. And we can care for one another, taking care of our aging population and ensuring that children have the resources they need to thrive in their infancy and early childhood. In short, the job guarantee is the MMT solution to our chronic jobs deficits. Instead of trapping millions in unemployment as a sacrificial tribute to the natural rate of unemployment, the job guarantee ensures that everyone who wants to work can have a job. And as we learned in Chapter 2, it is also a better price stabilizer. It spends only enough to hire everyone who is prepared to work, and it maintains a pool of employable people from which the private sector can readily hire at a modest premium over the program wage. Further, by establishing the right to a living wage job, the job guarantee strengthens the bargaining power of labor, reduces racial inequities, decreases poverty, and raises the floor on low wage work while building stronger, more vibrant, more connected communities. Has anything like this ever been tried? No country has implemented a full fledged job guarantee, but a number of countries have experimented with versions of the idea. In the 1930s, the U.S. fought the Great Depression by directly creating millions of jobs under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. The Public Works Administration put hundreds of thousands of men to work building schools, hospitals, libraries, post offices, bridges, and dams. In the first 6 years, the WPA created about 8 million construction and conservation jobs, as well as thousands of jobs for writers, actors, and musicians. That's me. I'm a writer, as well as a live streamer. The National Youth Administration created 1.5 million part-time jobs for high school kids and 600,000 for college students. As MMT proposes, the jobs were federally funded, but the jobs weren't permanent, and they didn't guarantee employment to all. And in that way, they were different from what MMT proposes. Argentina's Jefes de Hogar plan, hope I pronounced that correctly, wasn't a full-throated job guarantee either, but in 2001 it became the only direct job creation program in the world, specifically modeled after, unquote, the proposal developed by MMT economists. The program was launched as an emergency measure following a financial crisis that plunged the economy into recession and drove the official unemployment rate higher than 20%. It was inspired by the work of Warren Mosler and designed in consultation with MMT economists, Pavlina Cherneva, Matthew Forstater, and L. Randall Wray, as a way to quickly put people back to work. A first of its kind of the Jefes de Hogar plan created a federally funded, locally administered jobs program that guaranteed 4 hours of daily work in exchange for 150 pesos per month. As Cherneva explained, jobs were limited to heads of households with children under age 18, persons with disabilities, or a pregnant woman. At its peak, the program employed some 2 million people, which is a lot for Argentina, which has a population of about 45 million. About 13% of the labor force, almost 90% of the jobs were in community projects, and 75% of the participants were women. Just 6 months after launching the program, extreme poverty had fallen by 25%. Within 3 years, half of the participants had left the program, most for jobs in the private sector. In 2003, at its annual Growth and Development Summit, South Africa's government formalized a commitment to, quote, more jobs, better jobs, and decent work for all, unquote. The expanded Public Works Program, EPWP, grew out of that commitment. The program created temporary work for the unemployed to carry out socially useful activities, unquote. 2 years later, the Indian government instituted the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the MGN-REGS program. The program was motivated by a desire to narrow disparities between rural and urban incomes, to create opportunities for those living where unemployment was high. The government guaranteed 100 days of minimum wage work. with wages equal for men and women for any rural household. India's job guarantee remains targeted as opposed to universal, but it's one of the largest federally funded employment guarantee programs in the world. Studies have shown that by establishing a uniform wage, India's rural employment guarantee helped to foster gender equality and female empowerment while also improving transparency of the political process. So, yes, there are historical and even recent examples of governments adopting targeted forms of an employment guarantee. Most are implemented as temporary measures to cope with the crisis of one kind or another. MMT thinks differently about the scope and the ultimate purpose of the job guarantee. It's not an emergency measure to be turned on during a crisis and then shut down as private sector job growth recovers. Instead, the job guarantee is a way to equip our economy with a more powerful driverless stabilizer. Think about it this way. You wouldn't have your mechanic remove the shock absorbers in your car just because the city fills some potholes or repaves the roads. You want them there at all times because you knew you get a better ride with them than without. The same is true of the job guarantee. Without it, we rely on weaker stabilizers that provide temporary income to the unemployed while permanently trapping millions of people in an unemployed buffer stock. With the job guarantee in place, we can use full employment to absorb the inevitable bumps in the road. Experience shows that creating jobs for the unemployed works. It brings a myriad of benefits that go well beyond simply providing income to those who would otherwise suffer bouts of unemployment. The idea is not unique to MMT. It's been called the forgotten leg of the New Deal. It may not be unique to MMT, but it is part of the MMT core. FDR had hoped that Congress would enshrine a job guarantee in the form of an economic Bill of Rights, but his party never carried through with a formal commitment after his death. Still, the fight for guaranteed employment went on. It was an integral part of the civil rights movement, and it remains a cornerstone of international human rights law. Many now also see it as a critical ingredient in the fight for greater economic equality and climate justice. It's an opportunity to transform tens of billions of hours of human idleness into a wide array of jobs that will help us build an economy that is both more resilient and more environmentally and ecologically sustainable. Guardrails for discretionary fiscal adjustments. Next section. It is important to recognize that MMT is not a panacea. It won't fix our broken politics or force lawmakers to invest public money in ways that best serve the public interest. The U.S. Congress, along with the Japanese Diet, the British Parliament, and other governing bodies, are full of public officials who should, but very often do not, budget for the people. The job guarantee offers a partial solution. It forces the budget to respond automatically to changing economic conditions, and unlike tax cuts that never actually trickle down to those in need, the job guarantee targets communities that are hardest hit by unemployment. That means income goes directly into the hands of those who need it most. But we can't just enable the driverless feature, recline the seat, and expect changes in mandatory spending to steer us forward. We need discretionary spending too. We need to have decisions about how much to spend on the military, climate change, education, infrastructure, healthcare, and other discretionary programs require serious deliberation. Today, those deliberations occur in the context of a budgeting philosophy that is antithetical to MMT. It's a philosophy that tells us that budgets are supposed to balance, at least over an arbitrary 10-year period, and that lawmakers should demonstrate that they can pay for new programs without adding to the deficit. The coveted permission slip that allows legislation to move forward comes from a CVO that has itself fallen prey to the deficit myth. To get around the bevy of rules and conventions that constrain the budgeting process, lawmakers use budget gimmicks or simply waive the rules in an ad hoc and often partisan way. We can pretend the current process serves us well, but I think Senator Boxer had a more apt description. What if we stopped trying to achieve a balanced budget and pursued an ambitious agenda to rebalance our economy instead? Budgeting through an MMT lens means never striving for any particular budget outcome. Bigger deficits should be just as acceptable as smaller ones or even fiscal surpluses. The number that falls out of the budget box at the end of the fiscal year isn't what's important. What matters is building a healthy economy so that all of us can thrive. Are there enough decent paying jobs for everyone who wants to work? Do people have the health care and education they want? Can our seniors enjoy a dignified by retirement? Does every child have enough food, clean drinking water, and a safe place to live? Are we doing everything we can to keep our planet habitable? In short, are we tending to the deficits that matter? MMT teaches us that if we have the real resources we need, that is, if we have the building materials to fix our infrastructure, if we have people who want to become doctors, nurses, and teachers, if we can grow all the food we need, then the money can always be made available to accomplish our goals. That is the beauty of a sovereign currency. Contrary to Margaret Thatcher's dictum, there is public money, and we should not be wary of embracing it. As former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan testified, quote, "There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone," unquote. His successor, Ben Bernanke, went further, describing how the government actually pays its bills. Quote, "It's not taxpayer money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account," unquote. These are paradigm-shifting observations that should liberate us from the age-old question, how will we pay for it? The truth is, the federal government is already paying all of its bills using nothing more than a keyboard at the New York Fed. Taxes subtract spending power from the rest of us, but they don't pay the bills. It's high time we come to grips what it means to live in a country where the government is the currency monopolist. No U.S. president should ever again claim that the government has, quote, run out of money, unquote. And no reporter should ever let such a claim go unchallenged. We all deserve to know the truth. A currency issuing government can afford to buy whatever is for sale in its own unit of account. Uncle Sam's pockets are never empty. The government's spending capacity is infinite, but our economy's productive capacity isn't. There are limits to what we can and should do. MMT urges us to respect our material and ecological constraints and to ask, how will we resource it? Budgeting through an MMT lens would have us replace the artificial budget constraint, tells us to live within our financial means, with an inflation constraint that tells us to live within our biological and material means. As we've learned, every economy has its own internal speed limit. There is only so much demand that can be placed on our material resources, our workers, factories, machineries, and raw materials before we push things too far. Once an economy reaches its full employment potential, any additional spending, whether it comes from government, the domestic private sector, or the rest of the world, foreign demand for our exports, carries inflation risk. The good news is that because we chronically run our economy below its maximum speed limit, there's always room to rev up spending without risking an acceleration in inflation, and that is what matters. There was a time when our political leaders had this figured out. For example, John F. Kennedy sought the expertise of Nobel Prize-winning economist James Tobin, who served as an advisor to Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign, and then as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Tobin recalls JFK asking, quote, "Is there any limit to the deficit? I know, of course, about the political limits, but is there any economic limit?" Unquote. When Tobin confessed that, quote, "the only limit is really inflation," unquote, the president replied, quote, "That's right, isn't it? Uh, oh, the deficit can be any size. The debt can be any size, provided they don't cause inflation. Everything else is just talk," unquote. Kennedy's intuition was right. It was not the size of the debt or deficit that matters. It's the strain we place on our planet and our productive resources that matters. On May 25th, 1961, President Kennedy delivered his moonshot speech before a joint session of Congress, before requesting a single dime to fund his ambitious space program. Kennedy assured Congress, "I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary, but the facts of the matter are we have never made the national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership. We've never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment." Kennedy got it exactly right. Our material resources are scarce and must be managed. Time is the ultimate scarce resource. No one can squeeze more than 24 hours from a day. Human ingenuity is constrained by our existing technical knowledge and capabilities. Our technical capabilities and our material resources are the only things that can limit our possibilities. JFK understood that America would need to develop new technologies to carry out his ambitious space exploration program. Landing a man on the moon and bringing him safely back to Earth would require substantial funding to facilitate scientific research and the development of new technologies. Kennedy told Congress that no part of his space exploration program, quote, will be so difficult or so expensive, unquote. And then he asked Congress and the American people to support the mission. Let it be clear, this is a judgment which the members of the Congress must finally make. Let it be clear that I am asking the Congress and the country to accept a firm commitment to a new course of action, a course which will last for many years and carry very heavy costs, $531 million in fiscal 62, an estimated $7 to $9 billion additional over the next 5 years. Kennedy made no reference to taxes or taxpayers in his moonshot speech. To fund the program, he simply asked, quote, the space committees of the Congress and the appropriating committees that you will consider the matter carefully, unquote. He knew that Congress had the power to increase the discretionary budget to provide the billions of dollars he was requesting, consistent with the teachings of MNT. Kennedy showed that finding the money was the easy part. The real challenge would come later, as Kennedy explained. This decision demands a major national commitment of scientific and technical manpower, material, and facilities, and the possibility of their diversion from other important activities where they are already thinly spread. It means a degree of dedication, organization, and discipline which have not always characterized our research and development efforts. It means we cannot afford undue work stoppages, inflated costs of material or talent, wasteful interagency rivalries, or a high turnover of key personnel. To pull off his ambitious agenda, the government would need to command more of the economy's real resources, more scientists and engineers, more contractors and civil servants, more satellites and spacecraft and fuel boosters, and so on. Even though the official unemployment rate stood at 7.1% when JFK delivered his famous speech, Kennedy understood the moonshot might require the government to compete for high-skilled labor and other real resources. To manage the inflation risk, his administration pressured unions and private industry, urging them to keep wage and price increases to a minimum to avoid driving inflation higher. It worked. The economy grew, unemployment fell sharply, and inflation remained below 1.5% for the first half of the decade. 8 years after that famous speech, NASA's Apollo 11 mission safely landed the first human beings on the moon. But today, almost all of us benefit in one way or another from that historic endeavor. As the economist Mariana Mazzucato put it, quote, the launching of Sputnik in 1957 by the Soviets led to an eruption of panic among by U.S. policymakers. That panic gave rise to a space race that paved the way for the development of many of the things we now take for granted, the personal computer, as well as, quote, much of the technology in our smartphones today can be traced back to the Apollo program and related missions, unquote. Can you imagine a people's economy? The challenges we face today are very different from those faced by Kennedy nearly 60 years ago, but no less daunting and surely far more important. To avoid global catastrophe, we need to limit the impacts of climate change and adapt to the degree of warming that is already inevitable. To do this, governments must make investments in the U.S. and elsewhere that will dwarf in scale and duration the massive commitment of real resources required for the space program. It is not um, it is not melodramatic to regard our immediate future as a fight for survival. And in that sense, the right analogy is World War II. In his important book, How to Pay for the War, John Maynard Keynes explained what Kennedy later understood. Coming up with the money is the easy part. The real challenge lies in managing your available resources, labor, equipment, technology, natural resources, and so on, so that inflation does not accelerate. If Kennedy had used the wrong lens, then America might never have gone to the moon. If Keynes had used the wrong lens, the British war effort may very well have been too little too late. If our generation continues to use the wrong lens, we will not make the right investments at the scale and pace needed to avert ever greater social and ecological crises. The good news is we now have the right lens, and that lens is MMT, a just and more prosperous world, one that combines ecological sustainability with full employment, human well-being, a lower degree of inequality, and excellent public services that meet the needs of all, is within reach as we collectively expand our understanding of public money and shift our nation's focus away from an obsession with budget deficits. We can begin to build a better economy, one that works for all of our people. Human imagination is incredibly powerful. Transformational moments in human history have come about when someone or some group of people were able to imagine a world that the rest of us couldn't see. In many cases, such as with our previous example of Copernicus, the shift was simply one of perspective. But once the shift came, it spawned an explosion of new discoveries and advances. MMT is, in one sense, a very simple way of seeing the big picture of modern economies from a different perspective. But we should not underestimate the profound change a simple shift in perspective can have. We have let our imaginations become far too limited, and it is holding us back. We have been too restrictive in public policy out of unwarranted fears about numbers recorded in government agency spreadsheets. We have held back progress in science, fought unnecessary wars, kept living standards too low, and lived with less beauty than we could have enjoyed. Austerity is a failure of imagination, a failure to imagine how we can simultaneously improve living standards, invest in our nation's future, maintain a healthy economy, and manage inflation. Trade wars are a failure of imagination, a failure to imagine how we can seamlessly maintain domestic full employment, help poorer nations sustainably develop, lower our global carbon impact, and continue to enjoy the benefits from trade. Ecological exploitation is a failure of imagination, a failure to imagine how we can simultaneously improve living standards, maintain a prosperous economy, and transition human activity so that we are protecting people and the planet. MMT provides a profound toolkit for all countries to begin to reimagine how they can care for their local population, preserve treasured cultural identities, rejuvenate unique ecosystems, redevelop sustainable and local agriculture, increase productive capacity, encourage innovation. Let's look at one example of how MMT can help us find alternative approaches to improving real-world outcomes. One of the main challenges facing policymakers in the U.S. and around the world is the transition to sustainable and zero-carbon energy production. The transition of our nation's electric infrastructure has begun, but there is a long way to go to scale up renewable energy, energy storage, and other technologies to replace fossil fuels as the primary means of electricity production. Under the old paradigm, the policy debate is often based on either government mandates or market incentives. A government mandate requiring power companies to generate cleaner forms of electricity could leave the ratepayers, households, and businesses saddled with the extra costs. Though market incentives, such as giving tax credits to companies who develop more sustainable energy generation, can potentially stimulate a build-out of alternative energy sources, they can also slow adoption as developers wait for optimal economic conditions. As a result, our utilities might wait longer before retiring existing coal plants. How might an MMT-led approach introduce new options into the mix? One possibility might be the federal government could allow electric utilities to sell to the government at book value any high-emission generator, no matter its age, in order to remove those costs from rates. But this is a bit like the Cash for Clunkers program, the car allowance, the rebate system, which encouraged the residents of the U.S. to trade in their old, less but fuel-efficient vehicles for more fuel-efficient ones, but aimed at grid decarbonization. This would free up private capital for a rapid transition to renewable energy and avoid burdening households and businesses with higher costs for electricity due to a change in public policy. The federal government could go further, increase funding for R&D and scaled up deployment of energy storage technologies. The U.S. could have the lowest electricity costs in the world while rapidly transitioning to 100% renewable energy. That's good for businesses, the environments, and households. And it's financially affordable for the government. Note that in this example, the government is not taking over, but is rather facilitating a public policy outcome via private sector energy markets. There are, of course, many other options. What's important here is not whether this example is a good idea or not, but that we begin to imagine how the government's fiscal capacity can help deploy real resources effectively to achieve a clear public policy objective. As we rethink the kind of healthcare, education, urban planning, scientific research, agriculture, and housing we need for our future, how might our knowledge of MMT shift our focus to the real resources we need and suggest ways where a change in fiscal policy can help? Can you imagine an economy where private enterprise and public investment all combine to raise living standards for everyone? Can you imagine an economy where every rural and urban community has sufficient health, education, and transportation services to meet the needs of the local population? Can you imagine an economy that can measure and continually improve human well-being, not just gross domestic product? Can you imagine an economy where human activity rejuvenates and enriches all ecosystems? Can you imagine an economy where nations trade in ways that enhance living standards and environmental conditions for all parties? Can you imagine an economy comprising of a strong middle class with service and labor-based occupations that have good wages and benefits? Can you imagine an economy where all are insured, a carefree retirement with all their food, housing, and healthcare needs met? Can you imagine an economy where all manner of research is fully funded with a steady stream of successful ideas commercialized or rolled out to serve the public? In the United States, where we have an abundance of resources and labor, there's no reason we cannot embark on a policy agenda that results in provisioning our entire population with quality health services, by providing each worker with adequate and appropriate advanced education and job training upgrading our infrastructure to meet to meet to meet the demands of a low carbon world and ensuring adequate housing for everyone while redesigning our cities to be clean, beautiful, and nurturing of community spirit. We can be a global force for good, leading the way in decarbonization. Providing assistance to countries with real needs while ensuring our domestic economy thrives and no communities, from small towns to urban neighborhoods, are left behind. With the knowledge of how we can pay for it, it's now in your hands to imagine and to help to build the people's economy. So, rather briefly, I asked you at the start of this to keep in mind, but to what extent this final chapter on the people's economy would specify how we could meet all the deficits that matter from Chapter 7: good jobs, the savings deficit, the healthcare deficit, the education deficit, the infrastructure deficit, the climate deficit, okay, and the democracy deficit. I think we could see as we went through that the good jobs deficit and the savings deficit were certainly helped, that the policies advocated, the leading policy of which was the job guarantee, could also help some with health care, and with education, and with some of the infrastructure problem and some of the climate problem. And we can also see how the specification that we shift to fiscal policy from monetary policy, and we shift to a focus on Congress, to provide for the economy, how those things would help us, to fulfill the deficits. But I think it's also fair to say that, as inspiring as it was, that final chapter seemed to address more the idea of inspiration for a people's economy than it did a policy agenda for closing all of these gaps. Okay, and I submit that the positive parts, of the policy agenda that was offered by Bernie Sanders, in other words, the parts that did not include the pay-fors through taxing, would probably close all the gaps that Stephanie identified here, including, to a greater degree, the gap in curing the democracy deficit. Okay, I do also love that last chapter, though. It had much in it to inspire us to go forward, and it made the connection between what MMT offers and the possibility for policies in a very, very good way. So I certainly think, it was a fine chapter. What I'm going to do next time, I'll turn, in just a minute to all your comments. But what I'm going to do next time is I'm going to have, on Saturday, that is, I'm going to have a final session on this book where I give, my overall evaluation of the book, which, as you may have surmised, is going to be very, very, very positive, indeed. But I'm going to rant about it and wax enthusiastic about it for much of the time on Saturday, looking at the book as a whole and extending your view of the book. And then, in part, because Stephanie has made clear how important the job guarantee policy is to healing many of the deficits that she talked about in chapter 7 of the book, it argues all the more strongly for us to continue this examination, okay, of MMT by then taking up on Monday, okay, on next Monday, the first part of the new book, The Case for the Job Guarantee, written by Pavlina Cherneva, which, if all goes according to plan, will be out actually later tonight. I should be able to access that book, and I should have enough of it read by Monday that I'll be able to begin to go over that book in detail with you. And in that book, we will begin to tap the full possibilities of the federal job guarantee program and what it means for the people's economy that we are trying to build. And what is a people's economy? It is an economy that in large measure is run by the people, facilitated by the people, enabled by the people for the public purpose as the people see the public purpose. It is a bottom-up economy and not a top-down economy. It is it is an economy from which prosperity bubbles up, and all manner of other good things bubbles up. So now I will turn to your comments and attempt to cover them. I hope you like that. I certainly enjoyed myself. Steve Dorr says, I can't like but the economic description that says how the economy works in countries with a fiat currency, that MMT, laugh out loud, yep, all progressives should know it, centrist and conservatives alike. They should also forget all that BS about the gold standard too. Yes. Kay says, it's looking like Booker is going to win Kentucky now. Yes, I've been seeing that. That is wonderful. It is wonderful news that Charlie Booker is going to get a shot at Mitch, the immortal turtle. And Barbara, what or who is Violia? Now all we need is for another progressive to be successful in his senatorial run. And we can get one. We can get one. Steve DeVore says, I hope so. The country would be a better place without McConnell's 2 cents in everything that's important in the country. Unfortunately, there's a lot more than 2 cents in there. He controls the whole freaking thing. Steve DeVore says, I want to learn more about how Milton Friedman looks at economics in the country after learning MMT. And I figured, why learn something that hurts and kills so many people? Well, so you can fight against it, of course. I know enough. We're already living that way. How much more is there to learn about austerity? My goal is to help the country grow for communities and for the people, not kill my fellow citizens. But you're going to have to fight against the Friedmanites, so you got to know what they say, especially what they have to say about inflation. Case says, agree, Steve. We all know more than we ever want to know about austerity, especially the poor in this country. Steve DeVore says, I'm trying to figure out the best way of communicating with my senators, asking them to support and vote for the Green New Deal. For me, it's all about phrasing the question properly to get the response that you want. There are a number of different ways to phrase the question or phrase the communication, but I'm afraid in the end it may come down to saying, look, I know your views about the deficit, okay, and the debt, okay, are myths, that they do not apply to a monetary sovereign like the United States. So if you don't vote for the Green New Deal, okay, and if you don't vote for Medicare for all, then I'm going to do everything I can to see to it that you don't continue to serve me as a senator. Sandy says, oh, make an appointment to see them. Steve says, I'm trying, but I want to get all my ducks in a row. I need to get my storyline together about healthcare too. With all my health issues, I'm the perfect person to talk about Medicare for all. It's why it's needed so badly in the country today. We really can't wait any longer. That's fine, but get your ducks in a row in terms of knowing this book, because a lot of the objections that will be brought up by your senator are going to be objections about why we can't afford Medicare for all. And by the way, you need to become conversant in the facts of Medicare for all, how much they are likely to cost. And by the way, there's no reason to believe that Medicare for all is going to cost any more than 2/3 of what we are projected to spend right now on our current system. And in order to justify a position like that, you have to be reading the works of David Himmelstein and Steffi Woolhandler, especially that part of their work which pertains to estimating how much Medicare for all is likely to cost. Lana says, being unemployed is absolutely horrible. I have been there several times. I've been there several times too, myself, with all my education and with my PhD. I've been there. Steve DeVore says, I get so flustered when speaking face-to-face in situations like that. My heart starts racing. I get anxious, and I sound like an idiot, at least to myself. I've been told my outward appearance doesn't convey any of that, but I still go over all that stuff in my head afterwards. I hate that. And it says, if you haven't seen Warren Moses' short video called Dogs and Bones, I highly recommend. He tells the story of 5% unemployment built into the system, the NIRU, and how sending people or dogs for training is not the solution. It's only about 5 minutes with Italian translation as he was speaking to an Italian audience. Kay says, Medicare for all and FJG would free us all up to move anywhere in the country we wanted to go to. That's true. Steve says, I've been on disability since August 31st, 2001. I'm a pro at being unemployed and retirement. All I need is money to enjoy it. Actually, a federal job guarantee would probably provide the money to enjoy it, as well as a job to help you enjoy it. Because you can work part-time or full-time, okay, and you can work at a living wage, and the job you work at can be designed for you, as you'll see when I go through the case for a job guarantee. Lana says, what's worse is a lot of people were severely delaying receiving their unemployment due to system overload, etc. It's just horrible. Yeah, not realizing. Okay, not, well, I mean, it could be they did realize, but there was a limit on how long the federal government was going to pay the expanded unemployment deficit benefits. They're due to expire at the end of July. If people got a delay in receiving their unemployment, they just lost that money. They lost weeks of unemployment money that they could have gotten if the system was working properly through no fault of their own. Kay says, Lana, yep, and soon the bottom will out again when the help runs out at the end of July. Exactly. The positions that want to keep us enslaved to our jobs, says Steve DeVore, don't want anything like Medicare for All or an FJG. They all must be removed from Congress. It's time for America to grow with the times and end slavery of all types in America forever. If they think that's against the establishment, so be it. Screw the 1%. The fight isn't about them at all. It isn't. Okay, I'll admit it. I'm in love with Stephanie Kelton's mind. She's not too bad either. And I really like the way she speaks about MMT. Kay says, me too, Steve. She's way more intelligent than most. Yeah, she's way more. My only criticism of SK is that she's too gentle and maybe too smart for the average reader. Well, we'll see. We will see how successful this book is in spreading the word. Kay says, and when you think about it, it just makes perfect sense, common sense. Kay says, I'm not technically an educated person, but now that I've learned about it, it makes perfect sense. Steve says, K. Clark Ryan, I think in this political climate, Stephanie needs to be gentle. If she came out too strong, too many men would feel their masculinity shrivel up, and their only response would be to attack instead of think what she has to say. That's so important for all of us. And Kay says, agreed, Steve. Stacy says, I guess so, Stephen. But I don't operate that way intellectually. And to be perfectly honest, MMT is a kind of dry, unemotional subject, or it should be. I don't know about that. I think the policy aspects, okay, of MMT and arguing for those policy aspects is anything but dry, okay, and unemotional. Okay, says, I should have gone to college when it was cheap, laugh out loud. The biggest the biggest mistake of my life, I think now. Steve says, I'm in that same boat. I went, but graphic arts and printing degree isn't going to get me very far in politics or many other things I've learned since. Kay says, my old daddy always taught me to teach my kids to read and then they could learn about anything they wanted to know. He was right on that, and I did that with my 3 kids back when I was growing up. We went to the library to look things up, but now with the internet, learning is a lot better. It's a lot easier, I think. I've been in arguments with guys who got econ degrees from MIT, and they haven't a clue. I got lambasted today by a physician who says she is on the board of a nonprofit arguing for another poster that Cobra is a good thing. Just because somebody has a degree doesn't mean much. Yeah, in fact, it might mean the opposite. It might mean they don't know what they have to know. Steve DeVore says, yeah, my mom was like that. She wanted me to write too and keep a journal. Sadly, I never have. And Kay says, very true, Stacy. A college degree doesn't give you any real common sense, but true understanding. Some of the dumbest people I know are college grads. 7 years ago, many people told me to write a book about my lifetime. Laugh out loud. I should have done that and tried a couple of times, but working full-time and raising 3 kids doesn't leave much time to spare. Laugh out loud. But Dr. Joe, do you know how much it cost us to send men to the moon back in the 60s and 70s? I think by the time all was said and done, the program probably cost maybe 20 billion or something like that in the 60s and 70s. It was well worth it. certainly. Russ says I need to turn in. Good night, Russ. And Russ says enjoy your Friday evening. I will. Right, I won't be here on Friday. Says Cash for Clunkers was an awful program, though. It totally gutted the secondary and lower markets for used cars. Whoever thought it up was not very smart. Used car prices are still very inflated. Steve DeVore says, I've been told the same thing, but I get chastised from my youth. I wasn't bad, but I like women, some older women. And how would I even begin to write about that? Without actually naming anyone, of course, just wouldn't feel right. I've never been one to kiss and tell, but I've had some excellent adventures camping, skiing, traveling, and sailing. I grew up in Southern California and took advantage of everything around me. I almost wish I would have stayed there to build my business, but it wasn't in the... Susan says, can't wait till next week's staycation. Going to read Kelton's book next week. Won't take you a week to read it. If you have a clear day, it should take you about a day to read it the first time. On the other hand, it does bear reading 3 times. I've now read it 3 times. Okay, says Scott and I had an old VW van, one of the last ones actually made in Germany. That was a great old van. It was big enough to work out of and great on gas. Got some money out of it when we sold it due to Scott's cancer terminal sentence. We were happy that we sold it. We were happy we sold it to someone who wanted to rehab it. We always wanted to too, but never could afford to. Steve said, I had a 70 camper bus, hardtop. It didn't hold up well to a head-on collision. Okay, says, those were cool too. I sold parts for those for 15 years when I worked for my friend's foreign car parts store. Laugh out loud. Okay, says, oh no, hate it when that happens. Steve DeVore says, yeah, me too. I'm still paying for that one nearly 40 years later. Stacy says, so recently my county council voted to impose a debt ceiling limit to borrowing. I think that's insane, but what do I know? Well, your county council doesn't have MMT, so it doesn't have its own currency. So maybe it made sense for them. Kay says, I'm still paying for that car parts job too. Driving 150 to 200 miles per day ruined my back. Oh yeah, that'll do it. Lana says, my late mother used to pay, say some people with a degree are educated jackasses. Laugh out loud. Yeah, that describes Paul Krugman, doesn't it? Kay says, now Lana, I have to agree with her. Okay, guys. It's time to end this broadcast. Hope you liked it. I'll see you on Saturday. Please don't forget my Patreon account at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. I'll see you on Saturday. Kay says, Lon, I have to agree with us. They say it's not about the currency. It's about writing restrictive laws. And what if interest rates go negative? Yeah. Very well put, Stacy. What if interest rates go negative? Yeah. Yeah, you're right, Stacy. Steve says, good night, everyone. Dolores says, thank you and good night. And I say thank you all for coming. I end now.